Hello and welcome to the second discussion in the Queen's University course Identity, Conflict and Public Space, Contest and Transformation. My name is Dominic Bryan. I'm the Director of the Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's University. I have with me a social psychologist and a sociologist and an anthropologist to discuss today's topic. Milena Komarova is at the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation and Social Justice. Sam Pehrson is at the Centre for Identity and Intergroup Relations. And Jarman is also at the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation and Social Justice. This discussion is going to look in more detail at the nature of public space, at how groups behave and interact in the public space, and particularly how the state and those in power might try and control what takes place in the public space. So the first question we need to think about is what is the nature of public space? Milena, could you talk a little bit about what you feel the definitions of the public space or the public arena might be?
One way to understand or to define what public space is to see it as particular places which offer open and unlimited access to the public. Another way in which public space has been defined is in a procedural way. That is not so much particular places, but any space or any place that can be used for collective action, as a site of collective action, or for public address. So obviously both of these have their limitations and their problems, and what they involve is, on the one hand, a normative understanding of what the public and who the public is. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, the minute we mention collective action and public address, we know that questions of power are involved, and we need to kind of ask ourselves who and under what circumstances is exercising what influence or power over others.
So much of the discussion we'll have in this course will be about the physical public spaces around us, but it's fair to say that those spaces could also be something like the internet or various other discussion places.
And indeed, some would argue that there is this artificial, to an extent, or too strict a distinction between public and private spaces, that any private space, insofar as it could be on a particular instance used for public address or some kind of collective action, can actually turn into a public space on that occasion.
So whilst we are talking about the symbolic landscape and the physical spaces, the nature of those spaces can really vary quite widely. And also the nature of what we mean by the public can vary quite widely, and indeed can change over periods of time. So that you can see particular periods of time where, for instance, women wouldn't be allowed to express themselves in public, whereas in the modern era in most societies, women would be seen as part of that public democratic sphere. Neil, that the nature of public space in different societies will be different and will change over time. Can you talk a little bit about the nature of changes over historical time of the public arena or the public space?
Well, I think there's some consistencies over time in terms of the sorts of things that happened in the public sphere. The market, for example, is a classic use of public space. The market space is a defining feature of many urban centres in Western locations. But in terms of things like rituals or ceremonials or what we think of as demonstrations and parades, many of those were occasions when the public sphere was dominated by the ruling classes and the military, or expressions of force at the state. And the opportunities for the lower classes to use those spaces was much more rarefied. So would have events like Carnival when the roles were reversed and the lower classes would take over public space. But it was a very contained and very restricted manner. And I think really it's probably from the increasing urbanisation of the 18th and 19th centuries, you see a much more widespread use of public space for political aims of working class peoples and lower class peoples to contest the nature. So, in fact, you could probably think of the French Revolution in Europe as being one of those marking points. It's both a defining part, defining event, if you like, of the modern era, of the emergence of the modern era. And also, it took place in public space. It was not a coup d'état. It was not a swapping of ruler by one person to another. It was a class action. It violent, aggressive, occupying public spaces, attacking the Bastille, taking over those spaces. And that sense almost defines our kind of sense of public protest, public demonstration.
So whilst if you looked in certainly in a Western context at the medieval period, you'd have seen marketplaces as a place where all sorts of revelry is going on. In the modern era, after the French Revolution, moving up to and after the French Revolution, you'd have seen a greater variety of groups organising into guilds or trade unions, into all sorts of different ways in which they're expressing themselves in the public sphere.
Well, I think that almost the shift from focus on guilds, which was more of an elite process, to the trade unions, which again was a more mass-based process, might be more the marking point for some of those transformations, particularly looking through the 19th century, as people began to almost or effectively demand the right to organise themselves autonomously, which is what trade unions was about. And the battle for trade unions was about the battle for self-organisation and independence. And that's very much about taking things out into the public sphere and away from the more privatised domains.
And you notice through that period often the state or the authorities can feel quite uncomfortable with those expressions of power, because if all of a sudden you've got people able to band together in large numbers, and I think also a key part of this would be things like public transport. If all of a sudden you can get a large numbers of people organising the centre of an urban area of a town, of course, if you're any sort of authority, you've then got to sort of worry because there's a locus of power there that hasn't existed previously.
Absolutely. And you bring large numbers of people together, they are both visually and physically an alternative power. They are difficult for the state to control. They take on their own purpose, and they start to move in their own ways.
So for its part, the state also begins to organise.
Well, you see some things like in cities like Paris and Vienna, the way that public space is then redefined through the boulevards in Paris and the houseman's routes around Vienna, which allows the military to move back in safely around the city to control public space, so that as the mass of the population seeks to utilise public space, the state seeks to redefine public space so that it becomes easier to control. So if you like, bringing it forward to 21st century Belfast, you see the state controlling areas and moving by building walls and barriers between communities as a means of controlling movement. It's just a 21st century version of what was done in Paris in the 18th century or 19th century and Vienna and other cities, to allow the state to effectively exercise its control over public space.
One of the interesting parts of that is think about the different ways people express themselves or exercise that ability to enter into the public sphere. And Sam, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way that the experience of taking part in a group, because obviously you can stand with some friends and chat about common politics, and we could agree that this is our politics or that is our politics. But it's something, again, if you're standing in a group of 10,000 people and a speech is being made, what do you think is the importance of the way that the group identity is manifest in that space?
Well, there are a number of ways, a number of reasons why physically coming together with other members of your group in into a single space is very important, very powerful for reinforcing that idea, that identity. So one of the reasons has to do with validation, validation of your worldview, validation of your sense of who you are, where usually that might be something that you had to keep to yourself, or something that you didn't feel confident about. When you're with others who are all there doing the same thing, there's a sense that who you are and what you believe is being acknowledged by others, reinforced, and respected. So it can become a source of pride rather than something that you hide. And that's something that's really only possible when you gather with other people who share that with you. So that's one reason. Another has to do with your sense of connectedness with other people. So rather than feeling isolated, separate from others, when groups gather together, physically gather together, they help each other, they go through experiences together. We talked about emotional experiences last time. So those types of things reinforce a sense of connectedness with other people. And so that's a second reason that it's important. A third reason has to do with the feeling of agency, power and agency to be able to do things that you can't do by yourself, that things that become possible to do when you're with others and when you know that others will back you up. So for example, I think we mentioned before the example of gay pride. It becomes possible for people to come together and occupy a public space, fill it with the sounds, the messages, the costumes and so forth, that would not be possible to do by yourself. So when that happens, you have a feeling that when you're with others who share your identity, who share your worldview, that you're more powerful than you are by yourself. And that feeling of empowerment it's exhilarating, it's a joyful experience, and those are the sort of qualities of collective experience, if you like, that reinforce people's identity.
And you can think of lots of examples where one might feel that. I mean, anybody who's been to a big concert of any sort of music with other people and have experienced, even if those people are silently listening to a piece of music, the very fact that you've got everybody doing exactly the same thing has an emotional effect on you. But I can also think of, I mean, there's so many sports events where that is true. And I remember back in the 80s being at a Tottenham Hotspur game, and we felt an injustice about how we'd been treated. I think it was Barcelona, it might have been the beginning of the 90s, Barcelona, and the anger. And if I'm sitting watching a television, I can get up and be angry. But at the time, you know, I think people were throwing things on the pitch, and it sort of, you could feel the sense of injustice. Mm-hmm. It was just a football match, but you were with thousands of other people feeling the same. It's a very strong.
It's very powerful, and you know, if you think that it's powerful in the context of a football match or a concert or something like that, but when we're talking about perhaps identities where usually perhaps people are stigmatized for that identity, or where they are used to be in the position of being told what they can do and when, and as a result of the power that comes with being in a group, that's reversed, and now you are the one who's in control. That's very powerful. I think you know, if you look at things like riots and different kinds of rebellion, revolution, and so forth, where as a result of coming together, those usual power relations are transformed, and the people who are used to being powerless become the powerful. That is not only a very emotional experience, but it's extremely joyful experience. You know, something that is often not acknowledged is how sort of joyful a riot actually is for the riots, for the rioters. It's that exhilaration of being in a position of collective power when you're used to being actually on the receiving end and being told by others what you can do.
Yeah.
I think we get a sense from the discussion so far, on the one hand, to what extent the definitions of the public and of public space are mutually intertwined. In some sense, you cannot explain what public space is without talking about what the public is, or what the public is. And we are getting two things. One is that public space is obviously a context or a backdrop very often for the public to represent itself to itself, to express itself, but it's not simply that. It's just that it very often actually becomes an intrinsic part of who the public are at that moment of time. The public or the publics use it actively as a part even of the action that's being performed.
One of the greatest examples of how those public events serve to overturn types of power, I think, is the carnival. And in many societies across the world, versions of carnival take place. Neil, I wonder if you, from an anthropological point of view, could say a little bit about why carnivals are so. Anthropologists study carnivals a lot. Why they find it so interesting?
Well, carnivals throw light on something of the way that people see relations existing. They allow space for relationships to be reversed and to be overturned. Carnivals are what Victor Turner referred to as liminal spaces. They're time out of time. It's almost a type of a ritual period when normal time stops and you move into a special type of time which only exists for a short period before you revert back to normal time. The rules change in some spaces at Carnival.
With senses of empowerment.
Yeah, because the lower classes take on the roles of the upper classes, and the upper classes allow themselves to be abused and mistreated by the lower classes, but always on the condition that it is a temporary reversal of roles, that it's something a bit seen as a bit like a pressure release valve at times to allow things to be expressed in a way, but knowing that the following day or the day thereafter things will return to normal. But of course, not everything doesn't always return to normal. Things can move on. Sometimes those roles move beyond, but sometimes carnivals move out of people's control and they take on a life of their own, and they move more towards
can become potentially revolutionary.
Yep, a rebellion or a revolution, and things get out of hand, and people realise they like being.
Yeah.
As Sam talked about, there's a very strong element of enjoyment about breaking those rules. I mean, the very notion of the term carnivalesque is about the fact that in terms of riots and so forth, people actually have fun doing this sort of thing. We saw this in the 2011 riots in England. It was, for a lot of people taking part in the events, it was fun. We've seen it similarly in various riots in Belfast. It's enjoyable. People.
Interestingly, the element of fun is often by observers it's taken as a sign that this is not a genuinely political act. So you see people enjoying the riot, having fun, and say, well, this is just kids, enjoying being naughty or something like this. That it's not something genuinely political. And of course, that's a mistake. It's precisely because it's political, because it's empowering, that there's so much enjoyment associated with it.
And because if we accept that the ability to organise and manifest oneself in the public space is so important, of course different forms of controlling that also becomes important. So if we can think of what takes place within that public space, there's a whole gambit of types of what I think as anthropologists we'd tend to call rituals of types of events which were repeated over time but have certain rules attached to them, certain often traditions attached to them. And you can compare, so you'd have different sorts of events, like you can compare somebody holding a demonstration with a parade, where the parade tends to have far more rules about who can be in it and who's not in it. So I wonder, Neil, what do you think, if I was to say something like there's a demonstration there as opposed to a parade, what are the differences in the sort of rules between the two? What are they telling us about social organisation when you see those different sorts of events?
Well, I think some of it you hinted at there in relation to nature of organisation, that I suppose the difference is really kind of whether an event is a one-off or whether it is a recurrent event. If you have a recurrent event, it requires a certain degree of organisation and structure and expectancy about it. And recurrent events will often attempt to replicate what happened in a previous year, refer to something in the past. They can be quite different from events that are linked to a particular political process, which are one-off and mobilising of people. So the recurrent events can be much more structured, much more formalistic, much more rule-bound in a certain way. It may limit who's allowed to take part in it.
With particular people organising it.
Particular people organise it, particular people allowed to take part, other people allocated roles of spectator or sub-roles within it. It requires certain costumes and certain forms of dress sense, certain performative elements to it, which are maybe hark back to a long distant past or to a past event which people are commemorating or celebrating. So there's an element of formalisation, I think, which goes into some of the more ritual events. But, now formalisation can take place in other things. Formalisation and ritualisation can take place at football events, for example. If people wearing the certain costumes and dress as they watch it, they applaud at certain times, they go through certain ritual behaviours at certain times. So much of collective action gets ritualised in some way, but there's an extreme before you get to very formal rituals and less formal rituals, and then one-off events. So I think there's a spectrum within how events take themselves or play themselves out in public sphere.
So there's, in a sense, there's different levels of sort of normative policing to different types of event. When I visited a number of carnival events for years, I visited the Notting Hill Carnival in London, and in a way, that event seemed a moment of license, where as an individual you could go out, you can drink and party and possibly take drugs in a way on the streets in a way that you never would at any other occasion. And on the other hand, you could have an event like a Lord Mayor's show or some sort of event which can be very structured and where the rules are much more clearly formed, and as you say, it's a much more formalised type of events, and they're different forms of engagement with the public space. You could also, the other thing that you mentioned, Neil, which I think is interesting, is the commemorative aspect of that, because many of our public events are forms of routine commemoration, and a number of anthropologists describe them as sort of time-defying, because by their very repetition and doing them over periods of time and repeating the past, a word that's often used is a tradition, they invoke a sort of power that I think that seems to be very important and can make it also quite difficult for other people to involve themselves or for the state to control.
Well, they do invoke power. They also invoke a sense of, can often invoke a sense of timelessness, that they're resetting time. So a very formalised ritual will be marking a process of time, and actually sometimes either it can be used such as like a wedding ceremony to mark a key transition in people's lives, or it can collectively be almost resetting people to recall, re-embody the actions of a certain time. For instance, the Armistice Day commemorations on the 11th of November always take us back to that period at the end of the First World War, when that war came to an end, and reset time and tries to re-invoke some of the sense of standards and expectations from that period. It takes us back to that period and asks us to think about the war and the sacrifices that are made, links it to nation, state, monarchy, church, and all those institutions that were prominent at that period. So very heavily ritualized events are events out of time that help to reset time, help to define what they expect us as a collectivity to do. And they can be quite, although something like the First World War commemorations are linked to the nation and the state in the United Kingdom, for example, other forms of ritual can be linked to other key events in groups of people's lives. So it doesn't have to be something that's done through the state. Think of the Hillsborough event and the commemorations that take place through football matches after and the anniversary of Hillsborough, moments of silence and reflection of times to take people back and to take them out of their current state and get them to think about things.
And this seems to me to be a very common human trait, you know, particularly of the of organised states, the fact that you have public commemorations and organisations of events around that. It's difficult to think of any sort of a society, of all the cross-section of societies in the last 200 years, which don't have some forms of celebration and commemoration. You know, socialist and communist states will all have their particular forms of commemoration. So it's not as if this is just pinned down to one sort of political form. It's a very important aspect of the modern organised society.
I think that's right. I mean, one maybe other thing that I would bring in here, and one of the words in the title of this course is contestation, and I think that's another element here that's quite important. So if we take an example like the Remembrance Day or commemoration of the First World War, just as one example, although it's something that repeats itself, that has a certain form, it's ritualized, it happens in a certain place, a certain time of the year, in a certain way. Nonetheless, every time it happens, there's always a whole load of argument, contestation, discussion generated around what it actually means. What are we doing? What does Remembrance Sunday mean? Is it a militaristic event? Is it glorifying war? Is it
a critique of war?
A critique
maybe?
of war, or all sorts of meanings. And I think most political rituals are like that, certainly in liberal democratic societies. So the fact that there's a continuity and a certain form to it, that's what gives the thing legitimacy, but of course it doesn't tie down the actual meanings. And often there's a huge amount of active construction going on around what this actually means, and also specifically what should happen, what's allowed to happen, who's allowed to do what or say what. It's constrained by the past, but not to a point where everybody knows what's expected of them and just gets on with it. They are very often sites of argument and differences of opinion about what that event should really be.
And it strikes me that one of the ways in which those arguments take place, and in fact we've talked a bit about the spaces people are in, we've talked about the sense that groups involve themselves in it. The other aspect of what takes place is people use symbols. In a sense, the language of these events is the language of symbols. If you've got an opinion and you're in a crowd, I mean, you can try and communicate that by shouting, you're not going to get very far. If you've got a flag that you can stick up in that crowd that the whole crowd can see, you can communicate in a way you couldn't otherwise do. And it seems to me, and I wonder from a sociological point of view, Milena, symbols seem to be so important in these sort of events. Why? What is it about symbols that they get so utilised in these public arenas?
It's because they seem to capture in a kind of an essence what various identities, so what people perceive kind of goes in their social identities. So it's a representation in a nutshell, which is very visible, which has a very the capacity to be very visible and very obvious. Communicating in a flash, in an instance, what it is that these people are.
But it's also can be very vague and very general, and therefore it
has
can
the
be
capacity
used
to unite.
Yeah, because it means how you interpret that symbol and how I interpret it. We both might be happy with to stand behind a red cross on a white background, but it can mean very different things for different people, and that's the ill-definedness of a symbol is one of the key points about it, that it enables everybody or a number of people to say, yeah, I'm happy, I will follow that, but we follow it for different reasons.
That's the clever thing about group identity, and in the previous discussion we mentioned this idea of imagined community, or another anthropologist described as the symbolic construction of community, that we can all show some sort of allegiance to a flag, and everybody can think we feel the same at that moment. Whereas if you start talking to people individually, their own understanding, many Americans will show allegiance to the American flag, and then you ask them more specifically what their politics is, and it can be very, very different. So in a sense, flags or all sorts of symbols have the ability to get emotion over. People are emotionally invested in them, and yet at the same time they remain rather vague.
I think religious ritual, it works in a similar way, in a sense that, in contrast to something doctrinal that might be a place of sort of negotiation, difference of opinion and so on, that religious communities can be sort of joined by their shared practice of a ritual in a way that they might not necessarily be completely unified in their understanding of the faith or the doctrine or whatever. There might be differences there, but for example, the pilgrimage to Mecca, for example, is something that unites all Muslims. It's a practice that they all physically do and take part in, and their religious identity is defined by participating in that, and it's a way for the differences within that faith not to matter as much, because there's a shared practice there at that moment, which is the main thing that unites people.
And if you're trying to mobilise large numbers of people, you have to do it almost on a lowest common denominator basis, because you can't get that level of agreement. Look at the demonstrations in Tahrir Square, which were about getting rid of Mubarak, without any coherence about what would happen afterwards. There was a common aim there, but as soon as that aim has been achieved, the unity of that vast crowd starts to dissipate. So that you have a symbol, whether it's a symbolic figure of hate or a symbolic figure, abstract figure like a cross or a crescent, it has to be multivocal. It has to have lots of meanings if it's going to bring large numbers of people.
A lot of the anti-capitalist protests have been like that. I mean, when you look at opposition to big political events like the G8, whilst there can be many tens of thousands of people gathered there protesting against it, when you actually look in detail at the politics of what's taking place, there's a huge variety of people who often sometimes share remarkably little in common, except that it's the power structures that they don't like, and in this case it's the G8. So that whilst the mobilization can be very powerful, it's also quite difficult to sustain. It's very interesting when a mobilization, a big demonstration actually takes place over long periods of time. But historically, sustaining something like that over a long period of time is really quite difficult.
Well, in some sense, coming back to our contrast earlier on between ritualized, organized events and less organized events. The ritualised, recurrent, organised events are opposite in favour of something, pro-remembering this, as opposed to things which are against. It's very difficult to keep mobilising something against or mobilising against it on an annual basis, whereas you can mobilise in favour of or for something or to remember something on a regular basis. So I think there's another difference coming back to the kind of the ritualised or the less structured, less recurrent type of activity.
So in terms of the types of events that we see in the public arena, and in terms of the way they use symbols to express people's emotions, we can see how they can be very inclusive in some ways, but we also see other senses in which they can be quite exclusive and exclude people from them. But we also see that those varieties can be very powerful, so that we know that in the history of many of our states, the power to mobilize in those arenas is very, very important.
Just look at, for instance, just thinking there, the recent demonstrations in Ukraine, in Kiev, right? They're opposing the government. They're opposing the key figures representing the state. And the way they mobilise their protest, they occupy a key public space and they wave the national flag. They carry the national flag as a symbol. So we're opposed to the government, but we're for the nation. So the nation stands above the government. In that sense, you've got a key condensation of the whole thing. The occupying the key public spaces in the centre of the city to oppose your government, but you're not being against your country. In fact, you're uniting around your country, and the national flag is such a vague symbol that everybody can come in and join that. And as soon as you get rid of the government, or should the government fall, everything will break down into infighting again, as it inevitably does in those contexts.
So that tells us a little bit why historically the state, shall we say, although it's often difficult to define what we mean by the state, but authorities have always been very concerned with how they control these events. They're both concerned in the sense that they create events themselves. You know, authorities have their own parades, their own power they want to manifest through events, and whether it be a big military parade or a political parade or events, they want to manifest themselves in the public space. But of course, they also have concerns about how other people do the same sort of thing. So it's fascinating to me how the state reacts or attempts to control what takes place. And so that all states tend to have rules and institutions set up around this sphere, whether it be laws or various policing institutions which have been existing. And I think was mentioned earlier, sometimes cities are even designed around the ability of the state to move people in and out and to control what takes place. Neil, when you've looked at, you've done work in many countries around the world, how does the concerns of the state manifest itself in what it does? What do you see as the difference maybe between different states and how they attempt to control that sphere and their ability to do so?
Well, I suppose that one of the contrasts is, I suppose, is in the sense of the degree of legitimacy the state feels it has as to whether it can allow more of those big mobilisations or whether it aims to suppress any example of those mobilisations. And that will often be the way through the form in which the police take, how militarised the police are, how heavily they are utilised to act as an agent of the state rather than an agent of enabler for the wider population. And you can look at that correlation, if you like. If you think we talked earlier about perhaps some of the modern ideas of use of public space for mass mobilisations post-dating the French Revolution in the late 18th century. And it was in the early 19th century when the idea of a formalised police organisation was constructed, as perhaps in part as a counterpart to kind of those senses of mobilising. When you look at an earlier era, you think of things like the Gordon riots, when the military were brought in to control demonstrations. You end up with large numbers of people being killed, just as when you see the military being used nowadays to control mass demonstrations.
We can think of examples right the way through recent history in all sorts of states, including in Northern Ireland where we are now, where the military, where it had been a policing function, and the need to bring in the military to control what's taking place, or a sort of home guard, which has taken place in all sorts of societies, as a real sign, and in a sense, it's a symbol that something is going wrong, that power is under threat when you ask your military to come in and help police one of those situations.
Well, the military tend to be thought of as protecting the national borders and the national entity against another state, and if you have to turn the military on your own people, it's almost as if it is the case when the war is turned internal and the people are the international enemy. So I think that's a key point to consider.
Yeah, Milena, you've been involved in a long-term project which has looked at contested societies and contested states. What, in terms of the way that states in different places behave, can you see different ways that why the public space becomes so important in those contested arenas?
Yes, I suppose what happens in societies which we like to call divided or contested societies. Of course, conflict and contestation exist in most any society under some form, but what happens in such places is that this ability that we talked about earlier, not even ability, what happens in societies normally is that there are many identities that express themselves in public space simultaneously at any given time in different ways. And the state reacts or controls that differently. What happens in divided societies is that this ability is to some extent lost, so that kind of the use and appropriation of space, of public spaces, to the exclusion of various identities kind of gets taken to the extreme, so that certain spaces become occupied or associated with the territory of a certain collective identity. And the different collectivities do not have the ability to negotiate that among themselves, and this is where the state comes in to try and control or police it in some way, and that happens differently depending on the extent to which the state is identified with one collective identity.
That's
or
important,
another.
isn't it? The way the identity of the state is often structured. So you can think of countries all over the world, whether it be Hindu or Muslim relationships in somewhere like India, where the state, although was set up to be non-religious, you've had Hindu groups become part of it. You think of the setting up of a state like Israel, where Jewishness is at the core of it, and you think of most Western states which in some way, shape or form have Christianity in their identity, that despite the fact that you might ideally decide that the state should be neutral on discussing that, it never really quite is. And the way that the state then engages with all of those things becomes really important. Neil, one of the interesting things about the way groups use public spaces, the public spaces can be transformed in a fairly short period of time. Could you say a little bit about how that changes of time reflect on the use of space?
Well, we've talked about the notion of symbolic landscapes and ritualized landscapes, but they can't be seen purely as symbolic landscapes or be as symbolic landscapes all the time. So public spaces are used for demonstrations, for carnivals, for public commemorations and such like. But they're also there for much more mundane
often
activities.
The use of a market or something, a marketplace is often a...
Yes, they're there for much more mundane activities, for people to buy things, to go about their business, for transport and so forth. So you have to find a balance between those two forms, the mundane activities and the ritualized activities. You can't just have the mundane activities and no ritual. You can't just have the ritual without the mundane. That also becomes a role for the state in balancing, in ensuring that both forms of activity can take place, and that you have a society that allows both its ritual spheres to take place and have its mundane activities as the majority activities.
Yeah, it's interesting that often local authorities are keen, whilst they understand they've got to allow people to hold parades and demonstrations, they're often very well aware that that affects the fact that people can go shopping in that sort of area, and that becomes a bit of a contest in and of itself.
And we all love the idea of a big New Year's Eve celebration, but we wouldn't want to do it 365
days a year, yeah.
Couldn't keep up with it.
Absolutely. In this discussion, we've been particularly interested in how the public spaces work, how the public sphere works. And we've discussed how rituals like carnivals, parades and demonstrations take place in that public arena. We've been interested in the use of symbols in those events and why people feel emotionally involved, why these things become so important. And because they become important, they have a certain power attached to them. And because they have a certain power attached to them, the state or authorities are interested. So we've talked about why the state wants to control events, and also why the state might want to organise those events themselves, and how they interact with the symbolic landscape, the places around them. In the next discussion, we're going to look at societies where the political sphere is particularly contested and how demonstrations and parades play a part in that contestation.